nobody is above the law. And if any organisation or company...
I mean, I'm sorry, I totally love the fact that you're sitting here and saying that, because that's what we all believe in. We all believe in our institutions. But we also know the realpolitik of this is that Elon Musk, who's the richest man in the world, who's probably now the most influential man in the world, can put whatever he wants out, as disinforming as it is, and get away with it. Remember that sound? That was the sound coming out of the riots following the Southport stabbings back in the summer. And it seems extraordinary that even now we cannot source back the disinformation to one single person conclusively. But what we can say is that a clear pattern of social media influencers were driving a message for people to start to gather for the protests and start a series of actions that would see many, many people facing prison terms.
But how do you hold to account social media companies who have a global presence, who are not answerable to the British Parliament, and in particular when it's Elon Musk, who doesn't have much respect for what the British government is doing? Is there anything that our lawmakers can do to bring the social media companies into line? Welcome to the Newsagents. It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And you do get this general impression that everyone is scratching their heads about sort of an errant pupil at your school and saying, what can we do about him?
He's brilliant, but he's wayward.
He's brilliant, but he's wayward, and he just can't accept any kind of rules of the game. And that is where we are, it feels like, with Elon Musk, particularly because he has taken such an interest, it would seem, in all matters British. And broadly speaking, it feels to me that there are two approaches. One is that you say, OK, look, we've just got to cozy up to him and say nice things about him and get him off this hook about him being anti-British. And the other one saying, we have got to hold this man to account and we're going to bring him before the Select Committee.
Yeah, and I guess we heard more of the first from Peter Mandelson in your interview last week, where Mandelson was basically saying, you know, we've got to knit this one back together again, wasn't he? He's kind of, we can't be falling out with a man like Musk. But today we're going to hear the first broadcast interview with the chair of Parliament's Science, Innovation, Technology Committee, Onwurah, who has basically said that she wants Musk to explain the role that he is playing in spreading false and harmful content. And she said, no one's above the law. And I guess, you know, we're all kind of, again, scratching our heads going, that's nice, but is it true? I mean, what are they going to do? They're going to ban him from coming to the UK? They're not going to put him in prison here.
Well, I mean, we could try and extradite him, but I mean, we could try and we could put in a request for extradition. But I think with the new administration, it's fair to say that would be on the trickier side. Look, I thought what Mandelson was saying on Friday was interesting in the sense that he used a particular formulation. I'm not sure how pleasing number 10 they would be that Mandelson was talking about it, but he said that he's too big to ignore. And I think that is the one thing that we've learned with Musk over the course of the last year, right? Which is that I remember when Musk bought Twitter and we were all talking to people and scratching our heads and saying, well, he's paying a huge amount of money. He did try to back out of it, to be fair. But, you know, he's paid $44 billion for the thing. You know, it doesn't really make much money. What's it going to get him?
You'd love to know, wouldn't you, to go back to that moment where he tried to back out and see, you know, who was the sort of commercial lawyer that said, nope, you signed up now. Are they sort of thinking, oh my God, what happened?
It is, but I mean, we now see, of course, what he purchased, which is basically he purchased the world's loudest and largest megaphone. New York Times did some analysis on it a little while back showing that basically his own tweets, never mind, like we talk about the algorithm, we talk about what he's favouring, his own personal tweets dominate a huge proportion of the platform and the interactivity. We can all see that personally. We can now see, I think we can all agree, we've talked about it before, the site basically, unless you are a MAGA hard right, conspiracy theorist, maybe all of the above. It has become largely unusable, certainly as a news aggregator as it was. Nonetheless...
I mean, we should just point out, you don't have to follow Musk. Indeed, many people don't follow Musk, and they still hear from him.
You can't avoid the geezer.
It's like the 1984, where the loudspeaker comes into your
Elon
room wherever
is watching
you. Yeah, it's kind of in there the whole time.
You must hear from Elon. No, exactly.
Well, if you're on his side.
I think in that sense, Mandelson was right. And you're right, John, which is the extent to which it is unusual, and it has been noticed in government circles and talked about a lot in government circles, the unusual interest that Musk has shown in Britain since Starmer came to office, and in particular, the unusual level of knowledge that he seems to possess and show about some of the intricacies of British politics, which Mandelson was suggesting, perhaps that he had been primed by the Labour Party's political opponents. He said he didn't have knowledge of it, but he wouldn't be surprised if it happened, and therefore Labour could try and build...
I think that shows quite a narrow understanding of Musk, which is that it's not that he's specifically interested in the UK. He's talking to the Italian citizens for Giorgio Meloni. He's talking to a lot of different countries at any one time, but we're just not seeing that because we focus on what he says about the UK. I think in the way that Bannon always used to talk about the anti-globalisation, right? That's what he's doing.
But Peter Mandelson has gone on, since he did the interview with you, he's done another interview where he said that we've got to swallow your pride, find out who his friends are and try and get into those networks. You cannot just continue this feud indefinitely. You've got to get over it. He's got to be reintroduced to the British government.
So if you don't go down the, Keir Starmer, would you like to go and have tea with Elon Musk in America? Then you're leaving it basically to, I guess, the sort of smaller, more individual components of our government, of our parliament, of our law, of our legislators to say, what do we do now? And the first ideas are coming, as I said at the beginning, from Parliament's Science, Innovation and Technology Committee. Onwurah is the Labour chair, and she basically wants to start the conversation. Why are you sending all this disinformation our way? And recognising that is the first step. You recognise this is happening, you call out the site for what it is, and then you say, what are we going to do about it? And see if Musk does want to engage. Well, joining us now is the Labour chair of the Science and Technology and Innovation Select Committee. And Chi, what is your aim here? Because you're taking us back to the riots in the summer and the part that social media played in driving crowds, I guess, right?
Yes. So the riots in the summer, we talk about online harms a lot. I think there was nothing so violent and so physical and so real world as the paving flagstones that were hurled through police stations, as the experience of the asylum seekers who felt they were going to be burnt to death in there as the mobs were outside raging against them. And that rage had been fueled by misinformation and disinformation on social media. And the aim of the Select Committee inquiry is to really get to the bottom and understand how the algorithms, so the technologies and artificial intelligence, which were on the different platforms. X was on one platform, but it was also TikTok and Telegram as well. How that technology drove that misinformation and disinformation spreading so quickly that it put lives in danger, and it also wrecked high streets, across the country. There were 29 demonstrations and riots in cities across our country. So how and why is that technology driving that misinformation and disinformation, and how does it interact with the profit that these companies are receiving, and what is the role of government in stopping and preventing in protecting the public, and in monitoring or regulating or these social media companies. 3 wonderful young girls were killed in a horrendous, violent attack in Southport, and within the next sort of 2 weeks, that understandable and terrible grief was turned into violent disorder on our streets as a consequence directly of social media. So I want us to understand how that happened, what the technology is doing, and what government and others should be doing about it.
And does that put some of the arrests that were made at the time over the sort of response to the Southport riots in a different context for you? Because you will know that there has been a lot of sort of fermented anger about some of the arrests of first-time people who turned up, at these protests and said dreadful things. If they were driven by misinformation and social media prophets and bosses, should those sentences be re-examined, do you think?
I think it's an established principle that sentencing has to be done in the context of the legal framework at the time, and also that what is illegal in the real world is illegal online as well. And I don't feel that we are reducing the responsibility of those individuals who hurled flagstones and threatened and intimidated people. But it is important to recognise, and I think to go to your question, that there are others who have responsibility as well. And if we can find their responsibility, those who posted, yes, but the social media platforms that amplified that. And if we can identify how they're responsible and address that and enforce action against them, then there should be fewer young people or people.
You said something really important there, I think, which is that the real world and the social media world is now the same world. I mean, essentially, we've got to stop calling it social media, haven't we? And just call it media. We've got to stop saying it's just a tweet and say if it's defamatory or if it's threatening or if it's racist or if it's, a crime in real life, then it's a crime in the media.
It's really important, though, I think, for me, and my background's I'm a chartered engineer, my background's in technology before coming to Parliament, worked in technology for 20 years. We've had this kind of sort of artificial, in my view, line between the real world and the online world, and that doesn't recognise, the technology is such a bigger part of all of our lives now, and social media. I think it's over 80% of people in this country use social media. About a third of adults have used generative AI. It's here. It's part of our lives. And what is that? And it's absolutely. We have to recognise that there isn't a demarcation anymore between real life and how we communicate on social media.
But how much cooperation do you think you're going to get from the social media companies? I mean, if you invite Elon Musk to come to Westminster to sit in Portcullis House, do you think he's going to say yes?
I'm not going to predict Mr. Musk's behaviour, but I think it's really important to understand why we're inviting him. Elon Musk has set out very strong. Obviously, he owns X. He bought X, and he's driven changes in the nature of X as a really important social media platform. But he also has very strong views on how social media should work, the spread of misinformation and disinformation, and freedom of speech. And he set out those views. And one of the things he said was that he wouldn't come to the UK if there were people were being arrested for posting on social media. So I thought it was, we are seeking to invite those who can contribute.
Then you don't think he will come, because he has criticised the arrest of people that have been posted on social media.
And I think that's a really important reason, an argument why he should come, to set out the thought process behind that criticism. So I'm really interested to understand, because there is an important free speech debate here. I'm really interested to understand how Elon Musk sort of reconciles that. What his technology is doing is basically amplifying and automating the present day equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theatre when there's no.
And he's doing it himself as well. I mean, it's not just his platform. He is literally putting some of this stuff up there.
He is promoting what I consider to be misinformation and disinformation. But the reason which we're inviting him for is because of the technology that he has put in place. And I am interested to hear the views from Musk. But that doesn't mean that we're not in a sort of a walkover when it comes to protecting the interests of our citizens and my constituents. I make peace, if you like, with no one who is attacking my constituents and so that's what I want to.
I hate to break this to you, but Elon Musk is bigger than the Commons Select Committee on Technology, Innovation and Science. I mean, he doesn't care what the British government thinks. He simply doesn't care what individual governments are doing, because he's talking across all of them. He's talking to Italy he's talking to Giorgia Meloni. He's talking to.
That's a really interesting point, Emily. I mean, Tesla and Musk's innovation and companies are huge. He has a huge role. But he is actually interested in what the British government does, isn't he? Because he was unhappy.
I don't think he's not interested. I just said I'd find it very surprising if he was quaking in his boots, thinking, "Oh, Onwurah has called me over to explain myself." He's not going to alter what he does now, depending on a select committee's kind of
the
inquiry.
Select committee. This is a Science, Innovation and Technology Select Committee. You know, we are evidence based and we are absolutely rigorous in what we do. We're not inviting Elon Musk in order to have him quaking in his boots. We're inviting him because there is a real reason to understand what the platform X is doing in terms of its technology and that social impact that has, and we think he's best placed to give those views. If he can't come, then I hope that we'll get somebody else equally, well placed to speak to X. But it's important that we give him the opportunity to set out his views because they seem so strongly held and he's so keen to put them out on his own platform. We're going to have a rigorous inquiry into algorithms and social media and AI. We will come up with some recommendations. The important point is that nobody is above the law, and if any organisation or company.
I mean, I'm sorry, I totally love the fact that you're sitting here and saying that because that's what we all believe in. We all believe in our institutions. But we also know the realpolitik of this is that Elon Musk, who's the richest man in the world, who's probably now the most influential man in the world, can put whatever he wants out as disinforming as it is and get away with it. And he will be above the law.
There are ways in which we have rules and laws, and if somebody breaks those rules and laws, then we will be able to take action. Whether it can be fully enforced.
If he said something like, the streets of London are run by Islamists, and London has fallen to a terrible place where I'm sort of creating words which I could imagine.
I think he may have said similar things, and that in areas of social or media online we find similar statements.
So what would you do then? How would you hold him to the law in this country if he was let's say inciting racial hatred?
If he was inciting racial hatred, then I would expect the law to take its process, and for there to be a accountability through either directly through X, and this is why the Online Safety Act and the measures that we need to take to hold platforms to account as part of the Online Safety Act, which, as you know, is not fully come into power yet. So what happened over the summer is not clear. When Ofcom is consulting on strengthening the powers that they have over platforms, such as if there was incitement to racial hatred on X, then I would expect that the law enforcement would be able to either serve something on Mr. Musk or identify somebody responsible in the platform to do that. You may say that you're looking at me like you totally don't believe that's going to happen, but I do think that this is really important for public trust and confidence, that we don't sort of accept that that rich men around the world can just break our laws in our homes and on our electronic.
But they're not doing it in our homes. They're doing it on our computers. Well, they're in their homes.
Computers are in our homes and are now all
but he's not.
Okay, but let me look, you've got two different approaches. One which is yours, which you have set out in this interview, which is we need to hold people like that to account and no one is above the law.
And no, don't get me wrong. Everyone
we agree with that.
We agree with that. We're just wondering how you do it.
Let me just finish my point. My question is this. And you've got Peter Mandelson, who is saying we've just got to sue for peace here.
He didn't say that.
Well, he didn't quite say.
He didn't say sue for peace. He didn't use the word peace. He said we should make it our business to connect. Now, essentially, you're saying the same thing.
I am saying the same thing, in that we need to listen and have a series of voices, and I want to hear from. But I do think the point you're both making about the lack of sort of extraterritoriality in terms of enforcement in our law. I was working for Ofcom, the regulator, before I came into Parliament at the start of the internet revolution, when so many people said similar things. You said, we can't regulate the internet, we can't have any rules and laws about the internet. because it's actually, when it comes to things such as child porn, when it comes to illegal behaviour, we did. When it came to online harm, in my view, we took far too long about it. But when it came to terrorism or to the, nations came together, if you like, as well as police forces and, getting greater powers and also better technology. Each technology revolution, and again, this is the Science, Innovation and Technology Select Committee, each technology revolution raises new challenges, for legislators, for media, and we want to learn the lessons of the last time. And I get very tired of the assumption that technology shapes us, and we just have to sit here and let it shape our society and our minds. We need to understand what we want this technology to be able to do and not do, and then we can look at the long work of setting out that sort of legislative framework, which would be more the responsibility of the Home Office department than the Select Committee. But we want to make our contribution to that.
Onwurah, really great to have you in. Thank you so much. Thanks.
So we all woke to the news this morning that the US had temporarily shut its embassy in Kyiv, which it has not done in the past 1,000+ days now since the invasion. And you wondered whether that was because intelligence had been received that actually Russia's revenge for the use of long-range missiles that were American built was going to be that they were going to flatten the US embassy, or they were going to flatten other European embassies. And a number of other European embassies also announced that they were closing. Since when, so far, fingers crossed, nothing has happened. Long may it stay like that. But you wonder what is going on as Russia tries to work out how to take its revenge on America's decision to let Ukraine use long-range missiles onto Russian soil.
Yeah, I mean, look, this has been a sort of drumbeat throughout the course of the week, hasn't it? With the change of policy from Biden. Actually, he's changed policy again today, because he's also having authorised the use of long-range missiles, American-made missiles, within Russia for the first time. He's also authorised the handing over and use of anti-personnel mines as well, which is very controversial for humanitarian reasons. Lots of people and lots of organisations counsel against it, but he's done that as well. And clearly Putin has responded by changing the nuclear doctrine. And now there is all this talk as well of hybrid warfare, which is basically just non-lethal warfare by another name against the West. All sorts of threats about potentially sort of cyber attacks or attacks on underground cables and all of this sort of thing. Or indeed, and this is where you've got to understand that the Ukraine war really is part of a global great power conflict now, and we can see that in all sorts of ways. Or indeed, Putin providing more weapons, more munitions, more support to American enemies in other places, for example, Iran, or in other theatres of war. We've seen more North Koreans coming over to fight in Ukraine. So it is basically part, almost day by day now, of an ongoing set of escalations, a series of escalations, which we don't know where it's going to end up.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that I think what we're being told is that Biden's actions came as a result of seeing these North Korean troops in Russia and Russian territory.
11,000, they say now.
11,000. You cannot get your head around what that feels like, this sort of cross-continent. I mean, I know Russia, old Soviet Russia stretched pretty much, to there before, but now you're seeing this cross sort of continent tentacle. But I wonder really whether we have to be honest about, the timing of Biden's actions, which come just a week after, the election that the Democrats lost, and he knows what's coming next, and this is a way of bolstering in whatever form he can Zelensky to a place where he feels as confident about the next few months as he possibly could.
It's very interesting now. If you talk to people who are either on the ground in Kyiv or journalists there and so on, they will all say that the psychology of the war now has transformed quite quickly. In the sense that even as, this has basically been a year, the war's entering its fourth winter, right? This has basically been a year where pretty much relentlessly the Russians have been on the advance. They are paying dearly, and the casualties that the Russians are taking now for every kind of square inch of land is astounding. But it is absolutely clear that they are willing to throw everything and anything at it. And it's been a year therefore, where the Russians have been pretty mercilessly on the advance. And all of the talk, you've heard it from Zelensky himself with the change of administration in Washington. The talk now is of, at some point in the next 6 to 9 months, some sort of negotiation and some sort of settlement. The question, of course, is, and this is, of course, what Trump has said, right, is that he'll end it in a day or whatever. The question, of course, is, like, would Putin even be willing to have that discussion right now? Because, I mean, he says he is, but the criteria that he would want would be so exacting, i.e. no Ukraine NATO membership, Ukrainian acceptance of Crimea, acceptance of the occupation of all the land that Russia now holds. Now, when that is your starting and pretty much non-negotiable sets of positions, it's actually really hard, as we see with the Middle East. You can say as much as you want, well, let's have a deal, let's have a negotiated outcome. But they are so far apart, it's really actually hard to see what that deal would be, even if European states and American states, and maybe more and more Ukrainians even, want there to be one.
Well, we're joined by the former Tory Defence Minister, James Heappey, who served in the last government, but now free from Westminster, but still following very closely what is happening. And in the past 36, 48 hours, Joe Biden saying you can use these missiles, Russia rewriting nuclear doctrine, it suddenly all feels a lot more dangerous and precarious. Is that a fair reading?
Yes, but it's also as dangerous and precarious as it felt the last time that there was a significant improvement in the capabilities that Ukraine's backers were providing. What we have to be careful of is that we don't indulge Putin's narrative that it's Ukraine's backers, us, that are escalating. We need to be clear that I think what probably changed Joe Biden's mind is the arrival of 10,000 North Koreans in Ukraine.
You think that changed his mind more than the victory that Donald Trump's just secured? I mean, presumably that's pretty much front of everyone's mind on this as well, isn't it?
Who knows whether Biden is also having an eye on legacy, but the escalation, because I it's important that we don't sort of revert into our fascination with American politics. When looking at the war in Ukraine, the big escalation in the last quarter has been the arrival of North Korean troops in the Ukrainian theatre. I think Ukraine's backers needed to respond to that, and the obvious thing to do would be to provide Ukraine with the license to use long-range missiles onto Russian soil.
So can I ask you how you are hearing Putin's form of words when he talks about changing the nuclear doctrine? And before, their threshold has always been much higher. It was any critical threat to the Russian state. Now he has, in essence, lowered it to include anything that feels like, to him, a critical threat to Russia's sovereignty or territorial integrity. I mean, are you sort of like holding your breath at this point, or are you saying, I've heard it all before?
More the latter than the former, to be honest, Emily. Yeah. Now that's not to be complacent. I mean, if your listeners jumped on their search engines and went back through each, when, for example, the announcements were made about providing Ukraine with main battle tank, when the announcements were made about providing Ukraine with things like Storm Shadow and ATACMS in the first place, Putin and Medvedev reached for nuclear language in order to try to deter. And there are, even in nuclear states, nobody takes nuclear rhetoric anything other than seriously. But in non-nuclear states, that can feel really terrifying, particularly, for example, Germany. So, I think to a degree we're seeing, the normal cycle of things. And we're seeing Putin trying to establish the false narrative that this is a gratuitous escalation in Western support, when, of course, it's not. It's directly a response to the way that Putin has escalated the war himself.
Well, let's look at it from the other end of the telescope, though, which is what the West has said Ukraine can now do. Are any of these things in themselves going to alter the shape of the conflict or the battlefield itself?
I mean, I think, John, if you had a General, Admiral, Air Marshal on, they would probably tell you that it may achieve some sort of tactical or even operational impact. In other words, it will disrupt the course of routine Russian operations. I'm not sure that they would say, and I would agree with them, that it's immediately obvious that this has a political strategic impact that might accelerate the end of the war, even arriving into the end game of the war. But the harder that you can make things for the Russian army, the better chance Ukrainians have of seeing them off. And what the Russians have done is they've constantly adapted to whatever the capabilities are of the Ukrainian army at any given time. So at the moment, their logistics nodes, their command and control are just in Russia, just beyond the range of the weapon systems they've got, and crucially, beyond the range of the political permissions that Ukraine has got. So now by changing those political permissions, Russia's logistics is disrupted, Russia's command and control is disrupted, and that brings with it a window of opportunity for the Ukrainians to maybe start to counter some of the Russian tactical activity that we've seen over the last couple of months.
But isn't the correct reading of the situation that across a vast kind of front line, the meat grinder, which is that horrible metaphor of just throwing more and more men into it and you don't really care what the casualty numbers are, is working? That actually Russia is on the advance and bit by bit taking more and more soil?
I'm not sure I subscribe to the idea of any sort of inevitability. I mean, Russia is taking obscene levels of casualties in order to maintain that kind of weight of effort. And, the Russians are not invincible. There is a point at which they can't do any more. It depends on the willingness of North Korea to keep providing more troops, certainly. But when we're talking about things like Storm Shadow, ATACMS, the French Scalp system, which is basically the French version of Storm Shadow, you don't use weapon systems like that onto the front line, into the meat grinder. You're using those systems to, frankly, take away the ammunition and the fuel and the food that sustains the Russian forces on the front line by going after their logistics depots and their command and control centers 150 miles to the rear. The thing that could be transformative is, just as the UK in its donation of various weapon systems and most contentiously main battle tank Challenger 2 unlocked the Americans and crucially the Germans providing tanks as well. I think the French and British supplies of Storm Shadow and Scalp are probably quite limited now because they've been heavily used already. The Americans have got very deep pockets on ATACMS, but the really big thing that could happen is if Germany decides to donate its Taurus stockpiles, which is the German cruise missile system. And if Germany was to decide to do that, that would give an enormous boost to the Ukrainian cause.
And they're right in the middle of an election campaign. What is your sense from Germany of whether they're likely to go there?
My sense is that is not an election-winning proposition to the German public.
Can I just ask you, James, we're recording this at about 12:20, and the Ukrainian state broadcaster has reported in the last couple of hours that Italy, Spain and Greece have all closed their embassies in Kyiv today. As we're recording, I think the UK embassy is still open. Are you thinking that basically we have to take these air alerts declared in Kyiv really seriously and expect attack?
Yeah. I think it is. Putin was always going to do something in response to the footage of the first ATACMS being launched onto Russian soil. For all of the saber rattling, he's not going to press the nuclear button, nor is he going to launch a strike on logistics bases in NATO countries, Poland, for example, where a lot of the Ukrainian aid is delivered from. And therefore, sadly, for people in places like Kyiv, it was always likely that he was going to do something like this. My experience of these situations is that we have pretty good intelligence. Allies share their intelligence on things like this very freely indeed. And my expectation would be that the Foreign Secretary, the National Security Advisor and others will have had a conversation with the ambassador in Kyiv, and they will have done everything that they need to do to make sure that our diplomats and everybody else that's on post is safe.
We've concentrated largely in this interview on bombs, missiles, anti-personnel stuff, all that kind of military hardware. What about the politics of this at the moment? Because listening to Volodymyr Zelensky, it feels like everything is being prepared for some kind of negotiation, that he is expecting this to be resolved not in the way that he wants with a kind of total victory over Russia, but through some kind of deal that is struck once the Trump administration takes place. Is that your reading of it too?
Feels like it. One of the great adages that many Republican friends in Washington have said to me is, always remember to judge Trump on what he eventually does, not what he said. And so there is a reasonable chance that when in the Oval Office, he ends up proceeding quite differently to how he has said he will proceed. But I think he is going to try and end the war. I think Zelensky is steeling himself for that. It's that one of the reasons Biden has given these new permissions around the use of the ATACMS long-range missile and potentially therefore Storm Shadow is in order to give the Ukrainians every opportunity to get onto the front foot and take some momentum into that endgame. And in that circumstance, Trump is going to be a second-term president. His eyes aren't on re-election, they're on legacy. And all of a sudden, there's a sort of thing that starts to creep in where if the Ukrainians are on the front foot, if demonstrably US support is having a positive thing, does Trump start to think that his legacy is not the immediate gratification of an end to the war in Ukraine, but a longer-term legacy around setting the conditions for a more stable globe for the 20 or 30 years there follow? Almost certainly wishful thinking in the hands of a British European former defence minister. But there is a sort of school of thought, and there are plenty of people in Washington that think like that. And of course, the more that you can connect European security to Indo-Pacific security and the US's competition with China, the more that you can start to shape Trump's thinking in this dimension.
James
My
Heappey,
pleasure.
thank
you very much.
Bye-bye. Now, good news, all you people hungry to come into the studio and join us. You can't come into the studio.
Well, so you've led them up the hill and marched them down
There's
again.
not room in here.
Well, we've just grown our studio for one night only, for one afternoon only, into the Royal Albert Hall. And we're inviting you to come along. We thought it was sold out, but they have just been holding back one batch of tickets, which is being released today.
On the Royal Albert Hall website?
On the Royal Albert Hall website.
Come and see us.
Come and buy them and come and see us.
On December the 1st. We look forward to seeing you. We'll be back tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.